Hey, everybody, welcome to Trail Talk. Suzanne, I see you're up on there today. Nice to see you, girl. Okay, guys, welcome. We are in what we'll call the Brush Theater today. And we have our good friend, Larry Benson here. Larry is a board member, and you might remember that he read a book for us before, a couple of books,
Yes.
I think. And they were a little bit more children's books. Today, he's going to read from a book called Bud and Me. This book right here. Unfortunately, this book is currently out of print. We generally have them and sell them here in our gift shop, but they are working to get them back in print. So if you're interested after this, hang in there. We will hopefully have some soon. So Larry's going to read a chapter that tells about this car that he's sitting in. But to give you a little background, I'll just briefly tell you, Bud and Temple Abernathy are the sons of Jack Abernathy. Jack was quite a well-known man in his day. He was friends with Theodore Roosevelt. That's just to name one politician he knew. He was friends with a lot of really wealthy, prominent ranchers, attorneys, just, you know, all those kind of people. He kind of ran with those folks. He was an adventurer at heart. He was known as Catch 'em Alive, Jack Abernathy, because he could catch wolves with his hands. He was a U.S. Marshal and was appointed to that position by Theodore Roosevelt. He was the youngest man to be appointed as a U.S. Marshal. Yeah. Anyway, so he had 6 children, 4 girls and 2 boys. The boys were Bud and Temple. And Bud and Temple, as they were 5 years apart, or 4 years apart in age. So when they were 9 and 5, I'm not going to tell all the details, but they took a horseback trip to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and back to Oklahoma, unchaperoned. I'll say it like that. And they seemed to be none the worse whenever they got back. So they decided the next year they wanted to take another trip, and this time they wanted to go to New York City to greet Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore was no longer president in 1910. William Howard Taft was elected at that time, but he had gone on a safari and was coming back, and the U.S., he was so beloved by people here. They wanted to have a huge celebration for him, and Bud and Temple did not want to miss out on that. So they rode their horses, unchaperoned again, to New York City. And in New York City, this is following Theodore Roosevelt's return, is where Larry's going to pick up on their story. And so he's going to read a chapter from the book, Bud and Me. And Larry, I'll let you just go from there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Eve. I hope you enjoy this. It's a great story. This is a fantastic book. It sells out just about as fast as we can get it, but you can get it here at the Chisholm Trail Heritage Museum. It's something that you'll want to keep for forever. The name of this is The Brush. Dad decided we'd spend a few more days in New York City, resting after the big day of Teddy's parade, and then we'd take the train back home. Of course, he's referring to Theodore Roosevelt. So we put Sam Bass and Wiley Haynes on a train to Oklahoma. Now, Sam Bass and Wiley Haynes, that happens to be the name of their horses that they rode from Oklahoma all the way to New York City at the ages of 9 and 5. So it was a different time back then. I was sad to see them go because they'd been so faithful and served us so well on the long trip. But Bud and I hadn't meant to ride them back to Oklahoma anyway. We had other plans in mind. We were determined to talk Dad into buying us a car that we could drive home. There weren't any limits on driving age back then. I'd absolutely fallen in love with automobiles and airplanes, and Bud was just about as excited as I was. But when we told Dad, he was skeptical. "You boys can't find a machine small enough and simple enough for you to handle," he said. "But if we could, would you buy it for us?" Bud propositioned. Now remember, Bud's the older brother, 9 years old. To our great surprise, Dad said, "Sure, Bud laughed and said he doesn't think we can find one. But even as we spoke, we were running for the hotel elevator. We looked in, we looked in display windows up and down Fifth Avenue, walked around showroom floors, and talked to countless salesmen. We saw cars that sold for $2,000 and some that were $10,000. Without even asking Dad, we knew that even $2,000 was too much. When Bud heard the price of a Mercedes, he told the showroom manager, "You'd have to be a banker to own one of those." The man just smiled and shrugged his shoulders. Well, I tell you, I'm a banker and I can't afford a Mercedes, so it was really hard back then. Things were getting desperate. We'd spent the whole morning looking and hadn't come close to a car that would do for us. When we told Dad that at lunch, he wasn't surprised, and he said that if we didn't find one that afternoon, we'd have to resolve ourselves to a train ride home. The afternoon was much like the morning. The automobiles we saw were all too complicated, too big, and too high priced. We were headed into the last showroom we planned to visit when I glimpsed a small red car out of the corner of my eye. "I'll be right back," I hollered at Bud, turning to run as fast as I could after the little car. Fortunately, it turned a corner, then came to a stop. When I rounded the corner, I saw a boy not much bigger than Bud, sitting behind the steering wheel. Without even talking to him, I memorized the letters written across the front of the automobile. B-R-U-S-H, brush. I ran every bit as fast to get back to Bud. When I stood in front of him, I tried to spell out the letters and catch my breath all at the same time. "It's perfect," I sputtered. "Come on, I'll show you." The boy was still at the car when we ran up, out of breath from hurrying. Bud studied the car for a long moment and then asked the boy where we could buy one and whether or not it was hard to learn to drive. "I'll take you there," he said, answering the first question. "Pile in the back and I'll crank her up." We climbed in and watched as he turned the crank in front of the car. Then jumping in, he pushed two little levers on the steering wheel and one on the side. We were off. "That's easy, I could do that," Bud said. "Sure you could," replied our driver. "A baby could almost do it." And he winked in my direction. When we came to the sales office, the boy drove to the curb, pulled a lever beside the driver's seat, and the car stopped. We shouted our thanks to him as we ran inside. "This is it, Bud," I shouted, running my hands over the letters that spelled brush on the front of the car. A salesman stood watching us with some amusement. "How long will it take me to learn to drive this?" Bud demanded. "Almost no time at all," was the answer. The salesman lifted the hood and showed us the engine and explained about oil and gas and pointed where to put in the oil to grease the motor. Next, he demonstrated how to use the steering wheel to change directions. "Anyone that can turn a coffee mill could run this machine," Bud announced. "But I remember all the mountains and terrible roads between New York and Oklahoma." "Can it climb hills and go through sand?" I asked. "Just like a regular mudlark," the man said. The brush's chain drive and fuel pump made it ideal for uphill climbs. Most other cars at the time depended on gravity to get the fuel to the carburetor, so they did a poor job of going uphill. Not that we understood all that, but we were impressed to learn that in 1908, a man named Fred Trinkle had driven his brush runabout 23 miles up to the top of Pikes Peak in Colorado. Hill climbing contests were popular then, and the brush had won its share of them. One question remained. "How much does it cost?" Bud asked fearfully. $485, the salesman told us. We were overjoyed, a car that we could afford. We told the salesman that we'd talk to our father, and with great confidence, we also told him we were sure we'd be back. "I'll tell you what," he said, "if that little machine sticks anywhere between here and Oklahoma, you just send it back to me. I'll pay the freight and I'll return all your money." We could hardly wait to tell Dad about the brush. We burst into the hotel room where he was studying railroad timetables. "We got you this time, Daddy," I hollered. We got you this time, but I was too excited to say any more. I just jumped up and down while Bud told Dad about the car. We found an automobile that's just right for us, he began. It's small enough and I can drive it easily. Why, even Tim can probably drive it. It'll pull steep hills and go through deep mud too. I had to throw in my 2 bits worth, says Tim. It's simple enough that we can fix it ourselves if anything goes wrong. When we told him the price, Dad said, "You boys are fooling us." Fooling me. Finally, after a few more minutes of our enthusiastic sales pitch, Dad agreed to go with us next morning to look at the brush. I was too excited to sleep. At 4 a.m., I woke Dad up, but he told me in no uncertain terms to go back to bed. I obeyed him, but as I laid in bed with my eyes closed, I could see those letters, BRUSH, written across the front of that little red car. Dad did get up early and said for us to take him to see our brilliant discovery. I think he believed it was something we had imagined. But when he saw it, he got as excited as we had been the day before. The salesman probably thought we were all 3 crazy, but he called for another man to take us on a test drive. We were on a street crowded with people when the man traded seats with Bud. This was his first driving lesson ever, and Bud was very careful. We both knew our hopes depended on his good performance. We drove for about 30 minutes, stopping, starting, and rounding corners without hitting a single person. It's pretty good. Dad was suitably impressed. He let Bud and me go out with the salesman again that afternoon. Late in the day, when he joined us again, I showed him that I could drive the car too, and he was surprised that we both had learned so quickly. The next day, Bud drove down to Broadway without any mishaps, and Dad finally bought the car. Obviously, more adventures were in store for us. By this time, Dad was getting the car fever too. He hadn't learned to drive as we had, but he saw that it was easy. So he decided to look for a larger car to drive back to Oklahoma, one that could carry the whole family. The Maxwell Model E30 horsepower touring car, a real luxury car at the time, turned out to be just what Dad wanted. With a metal body and a high-grade leather upholstery, it was much heavier and much more expensive than our little wooden car. It also featured a balance spring suspension for easy riding. Moreover, it had easier starting, a multiple disc clutch, and a double brake design. All of this meant that it was much more complicated than the Brush. So Dad hired a chauffeur to drive him back to Oklahoma. He figured he could learn to drive along the way. On July the 6th, friends gave us a party and farewell luncheons at the Astor Hotel. Bud and I did some more speech making, and then a man gave us each a 21 jewel pocket watch. Around 3 o'clock, we were ready to leave.
We got a picture of them
Yes,
right here.
That's a picture of them loaded up,
Can you see them there on
loaded up
there?
in the car,
Yeah.
getting ready to leave New York City.
Getting ready to go. Look at that. Little bitty boys driving a car.
Yes. Crank her up, Bud said, very much aware of the crowd gathered around us. I got her cranked up on the second try, and the motor purred like a kitten. Our drive home had begun. People waved and called our names from the sidewalks as we followed the Maxwell out of the city. The Brush was perfect. And at 30 miles an hour, we felt as if we were riding on the wind. We had no trouble keeping up with the Maxwell, and once Bud pulled out and passed Dad, laughing and yelling. Dad didn't appreciate our daring maneuvers and told us not to take chances until we become more skilled. That night, we had our first accident. The Maxwell had just pulled up in front of our hotel in Poughkeepsie, New York, where we'd planned to spend the night. Bud was close behind, but before he came to a stop, I jumped out of the car and ran to meet Dad. Bud didn't see me cut right in front of the Brush, and consequently, I was knocked down and run right over. It was a dumb thing for me to do, and for a minute, Dad thought I must have been killed. Luckily, I wasn't. The breath had been knocked out of me, my clothes ruined, but no bones had been broken. Then Dad really gave us a serious lecture about cars and safety. There's a responsibility that goes with driving, he said. We're going to obey the rules. Tim, never jump out of a car until it comes to a complete stop. And whoever is driving must be cautious and pay attention to everything. Above all, don't take any unnecessary chances. Bud and I were afraid that Dad would call off the whole adventure, so we were very quiet and we quickly agreed with everything he said. Smart boys. The second day, we drove from Poughkeepsie to Rochester, New York, and the next day on to Buffalo. We stopped at the Iroquois Hotel there and drove to Niagara Falls to tour the Cave of Winds, the Maid of the Mist, and of course the falls. The roads between Niagara and Buffalo were good, and we made exceptional time on that jaunt. There's another picture of them making exceptional time on the jaunt.
Yeah. There, they've got a little banner laying across their car. I can't really see. Something Club of America. It might be some kind of like Automobile Club of America or something, but they kind of got nice little outfits on too. They're little riding clothes or something.
They're dressed pretty nice.
Yeah, they are.
Dad was getting eager to get back to Oklahoma because he had used up most of his vacation time. From Buffalo, we drove all the way to Cleveland, Ohio in one day. The roads were dusty, but we had goggles and dusters, so we were prepared. The only real mishap was a flat tire on Dad's car. In every small town we passed through, people came out to greet us. In Plainsville, Ohio, they said we attracted more people than the last fire in town. And in those days, everybody in a small town turned out to see a fire. In Cleveland, we had dinner and a group of people who asked us questions about Roosevelt and Taft, New York City, and especially about our car. I bubbled over with enthusiasm about the brush and told them how easy it was to drive. Bud gave me a turn at the wheel ever so often, and I could drive easily, except that reaching the pedals was a problem. My legs were so short that I had to sit way up on the edge of the seat with my body next to the steering wheel. It was awkward, but I still thought driving was just as much fun as anything I'd ever done. In Cleveland, one man thought I was joking when I said I drove the brush. What, Temple? I thought you were only 6 years old. Old enough, I said rather matter-of-factly. We drove through rain all the way from Toledo, Ohio to Detroit, Michigan, and the dirt road became one long mud puddle. But Bud discovered he could make the brush skid with fast turns in the mud, and we were having a great time. We sped along in the lightweight brush, but Dad and his chauffeur in Maxwell, I think there's something catching up behind us here. It's a herd of cattle. We had to wait for them a lot because they had to stop and get the big touring car unstuck from the mud. The brush factory was located in Detroit. About time for a campfire, hear a coyote. The brush factory was located in Detroit, and we visited it. I was amazed to see a whole train filled with, you kids, stop it. Train filled with automobiles. They told us they were shipping 100 cars a day. Unbelievable. In Battle Creek, Michigan, we toured the Kellogg's plant where breakfast cereal was being made. Bud pointed to a picture on the wall. It showed a plate of meat labeled 60 cents. The meat would supposedly feed only one person, while the box of cereal beside it would feed 10 people. Bud said a car compared to a horse was just as good a deal as that cereal compared to the meat. Just think about the people who say they can't afford a car. He said they'll pay over $200 for a good horse and about the same for a buggy. Next, they buy the harness and have to feed and care for the horse. In a year's time, they've spent more than the price of our runabout, and our machine will run for a year for what it costs to keep a horse for 6 months. Besides, an automobile doesn't get the colic and the bots. And finally, dive the blind staggers. Anyone who can afford a horse and buggy can better afford a machine like the one we drive. If Bud was telling me all that, he was preaching to the choir. I love the brush. In fact, I told one reporter, This machine is a little Wildcat. The name stuck. The brush became the Wildcat. We drove west across Illinois and into Iowa. At the Chamberlain Hotel in Des Moines, I ran into that old problem again. Girls who wanted to kiss me. Several of them ganged up on me in the hall outside our room and stole a kiss or two. I was outraged, all the more so when Bud teased me. "You're afraid of girls," he said. "You're just scared of a bunch of girls." There is a picture of Bud standing there with all the girls.
Oh,
Yeah,
oh, there
Yeah.
sure is. Yeah.
they're chasing him
Look at him.
to the car.
Here's Bud and this is Temple. Look at that little scowl on his face. Can you see that? He's pretty upset those girls are after him.
He was not happy. Yeah.
And they weren't little girls.
No,
either.
no. That made me madder when Bud laughed at me. And to prove him wrong, I walked straight up to the prettiest girl of the bunch and I planted a big kiss on her cheek. She blushed and giggled while Dad's chauffeur and Bud howled with laughter. For my part, I was glad we'd be leaving the next morning. I didn't want to have to do any more kissing if I could help it. From Des Moines to Kansas City, the road crossed one muddy hill after another. Bud and I had to wait for the Maxwell again. South of Kansas City, though, the roads were dry, even if they weren't in good condition. We made better time for a while until we had a terrible mishap. Just north of Wellington, Bud and I were ahead of the Maxwell when I heard Dad holler, "Stop." We looked back and saw the Maxwell in flames. The teddy bear and a suitcase full of treasures from our trip were going up in smoke. Dad and his chauffeur threw sand on the fire and soon we got it put out. But Dad's beautiful Maxwell was practically ruined. When we got to Wellington, we got it fixed enough to make it home, but the Maxwell was never the same again. Bud and I were terribly disappointed to have our treasures from the trip burned, but we figured our memories and the things we had learned were the most important keepsakes of the trip. As we drew near Oklahoma City, about 20 cars came to meet us. We were amazed to discover that there were that many cars in all of Oklahoma, and even more amazed to find out that 12 of them were brush runabouts, just like ours. The caravan escorted us into the city where people crowded the streets and sidewalks to welcome us home. Bud drove straight to the Lee Huckins Hotel where our family and friends had gathered to greet us. There was a luncheon and then we spent all afternoon at the fairgrounds watching car races sponsored by the Oklahoma Auto Club. We drove in front of the grandstand and the master of ceremonies went on and on about what brave little boys we were. Bud gave a speech. We saw Roosevelt. He remembered us too. We rode in the parade with Teddy and had a bully time. I never saw so many people in my life. We enjoyed the trip to New York on horseback. Sam Bass and Wiley Haynes, our Broncos, acted fine all the way. They were a little shy in the cities, but didn't give us too much trouble. We shipped them back home from New York, so we'll be glad to get back to the farm to see our ponies. When my turn came, I just said, "Hello, everybody, we're glad to be home." We had driven for 23 days and registered 2,512 miles on our speed thermometers, as they were called in those days. We'd set a cross-country record on that trip home, and we'd made a big leap ahead into the future with our speedy drive back. But it was really good to be surrounded by familiar faces. We were ready to enjoy being home for a while.
All right. And that's the end of chapter 3. Oh, there we go.
Couple of pictures.
Couple
of
of
them
pictures
getting
of them. There's, looks like Temple right up
Yeah.
there driving. His face was practically in the
Yeah.
steering wheel
It
to
is.
drive. And then there they are when they're in New York City, all dressed up, maybe on the way up. Got their little fancy leather gloves on and everything. Well, Larry, thank you for reading that for us, guys. Wasn't that,
Thank you.
isn't that, now, that is a true story. Those events actually happened.
Absolutely.
Temple Abernathy kind of told all of that information to his wife, Alta, and then she wrote the book. And anyway, like I said, it is such a fun book to read. It's fast. It's very fast. You could read it in a day.
Yes.
Easily. Anyway, Bud and me, during our education program here at the Heritage Center right now, this first part of the school year, this is what we're teaching. And yeah, and we have the brush here. This is a 1909, and Bud and Temples was a 1910. But anyway, come by and see it. It'll be here for another week or so before we switch our sessions. So you guys want to come by and check it out. It may be here for another couple of weeks. Anyway, tune in tomorrow, because tomorrow on Trail Talk, I've kind of been doing a little deep dive on the brush vehicles, and I'm no mechanic or car buff, but I do have a lot of really interesting information that I'm going to share with you about the car, and we're going to kind of look it over from one end to the other. So be sure and tune in and catch all of that. Now, we don't have any copies of Bud and Me right now in the gift shop, but when we do, we will make it known on our website. But I checked, and the Duncan Public Library has one copy. It's checked out right now, but there is a copy. So if you want to read the whole book, get your name on the list over there and see if you can check it out. Again, I want to thank Larry for coming and reading, and spin that thing around so Larry, you can come over here and happy trails off the program with me. So guys, we'll see you tomorrow. And Suzanne, looks like you're already off of mute. So on 3, we'll say trails. 1, 2, 3.
Happy
trails.
Trails.
Bye.
Bye.